I flew on a rare 737-600. The 600 model is the shortest variant of the 737 next generation family, and flew for the first time in 1998. In the 737 lineup, the 600 essentially replaced the 500, the shortest version of the classic series, and both can carry about the same number of people as the iconic 737-200. However, the 600 did not sell all that well, and only 69 of them were ever built. For us here in Canada, though, they were a fairly common sight, since WestJet had 13 of the type. Unfortunately, all of those were quietly retired in 2021, putting the 600 in the rare category once again. In a sudden twist of fate, though, 2 of those former WestJet 600s were brought out of the desert in 2022 to fly for a new charter airline called Aeroflyer. Aeroflyer is the passenger charter division of KF Aerospace, the same KF that used to fly 727s and DC-10s, and as it happened, one of those 600s would be based right here in Calgary. The thing is, most of Aeroflyer's flying is in workforce transportation for natural resource companies, and as fun as it would be to charter a 737-600, it's a little harder to find 100 other people who would also want to do the same. That said, some scheduled airlines have taken advantage of Aeroflyer services over the years, wet leasing the 737-600s to cover their own flights. In June last year, one of those airlines was Yukon-based Air North. At the time, they were short of aircraft while waiting for their first 737-800s to finish up pre-delivery maintenance, also at KF in Kelowna. On one of those days in June, one of the flights being operated by Aeroflyer was Air North's short hop between Vancouver and Victoria. From what I can tell, there are just 13 737-600s still flying in the world, 6 for the US's secretive Janet Airlines, 5 for Algeria's Air Algérie, and the 2 Aeroflyer ones. So, seeing how rare the type is globally, my good friend Will and I could not pass up the chance to get one, or in this case, 2 more flights in on the shortest 737NG. Air North operates out of the domestic terminal at YVR, and has their own dedicated check-in area right on the south side of the departure hall. Their flights from here to Victoria are among the shortest 737 flights in the country, and are usually tag-ons to their existing flights between Vancouver and Whitehorse. Those Vancouver to Victoria flights can be booked separately though, and are a pretty inexpensive way to fly some of Air North's classic 737s. I actually did just that back in 2020 on their 737-500. Unfortunately, our gate was one of the mediocre ones on the far end of the B gates, with an equally mediocre view. YVR as a whole is a fantastic airport, with arguably the exception of this part, so it's interesting that they still haven't done anything to it. Our 737-600 for today, though, was soon taxiing in from Kelowna, another one of Air North's tag-on routes, and registered as Charlie Golf Kilo Foxtrot Quebec. This plane was delivered to WestJet in August 2006, and flew with them for just under 15 years, until being stored in Marana, Arizona in March 2021. It was ferried from there to KF's facility in Hamilton, Ontario in February 2022, and entered service with Aeroflyer later that year. Now, I've actually flown on this plane once before in 2019 when it was still with WestJet between Calgary and Abbotsford. All 13 of the WestJet 737-600s were also the last of the 600s to be built, and this one was the second to last 737-600 ever made. I am really glad to see this rare type got a second chance with KF, even if it is ultimately a slightly shorter 737. It didn't take long for the inbound passengers to deplane, and we were soon boarding for Victoria.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a boarding announcement for Air North Flight 571 with service to Victoria.
Before we hop on board though, I wanted to let you all know I made some actual calendars for 2025 with my photos and still have a couple of them left for sale. If you'd like to order one, there'll be a link in the description below, and all the proceeds will be going to the Time Air Historical Society to help preserve airliners here in Canada. Thanks so much for all your support, and on with the video. Aeroflyer 737-600s are arranged in an all-economy layout, with a total of 119 seats. If these look familiar, yes, they are the same style of seats you see on WestJet 737s. My seat for this first flight would be behind the wing in 16A. Since the 600 fuselage is so short, there's actually only 5 more rows behind here, and for a normal seat, the legroom is alright. Out the window is also a nice view behind the wing. The biggest difference here is the lack of winglets, which is pretty rare for any 737NG. The 737-600s never got them since there weren't that many built, and that's something I made a video on a couple years ago. Aside from that, the interior is pretty familiar. When it was with WestJet, this plane still had the older style seats with the live TVs, all of which are now long gone. Since KF does lots of maintenance for them, I suspect these seats were left over from other WestJet 737s that left the fleet at some point in the past couple of years. For today's flight though, our plane was nowhere near full, and boarding was completed very shortly.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. From the flight deck, your captain speaking. I'll be on behalf of myself and today's flight crew. I'd like to welcome you on board Air North Flight 571 in service to Victoria. Just finishing up with the final numbers, and we're waiting for the load sheet, and we'll be on our way. Once we are looking at 19 minutes, 19 minutes at 5,000 feet.
With that, here's us making a very speedy takeoff from YVR's runway 26 left.
Être rangé sous le siège devant vous ou dans les compartiments supérieurs. Nous vous remercions de votre attente.
Vancouver to Victoria is one of the shortest and busiest air routes in the country, and somehow it also has one of the biggest varieties of aircraft operating it. As you all know by now, there's not a lot of time in the air between the two cities, so here's a quick look around inside. Since these are the same WestJet Recaro seats, there's the usual mesh seat back pocket, power outlets which weren't activated, and the standard tray table that slides. In their literature package at the top, Aeroflyer had a little pamphlet showing how to connect to their Wi-Fi based in-flight entertainment. It wasn't working on this flight, but again, we didn't even go above 5,000 feet. There were also a couple air sickness bags and the safety card for the 737-600. As you can see, this was not a full airplane by any stretch. Air North mostly flies this route for travelers continuing on to Victoria from Whitehorse or vice versa. Today though, it worked out really well to get this very unique airplane and airline combination. However, as is to be expected when you fly a jet between two airports barely 60 kilometers apart, we were only airborne for 15 minutes. Soon enough, we were passing over the southern Gulf Islands and starting our approach into Victoria International Airport. Here's the arrival onto runway 27. As expected, this would be a pretty short turnaround here in Victoria, so we headed off the plane and into the terminal. For the flight back, there'd be a similar number of people on board, most of them continuing on to Whitehorse, so we stayed close by. YYJ is one of the nicer airports in Western Canada, although this upper level where the JetBridge gates are does have much less space than the turboprop gates down below. Walking around down there was about all there was to do here anyway. Since filming this though, YYJ is now home to Hawaii Mars, one of the last two remaining Martin Mars flying boats, on display at the British Columbia Aviation Museum. Having been here for its final landing in the water just west of the airport, I will definitely have to come back someday and actually see it up close. In the meantime, we also got a couple more views of today's special, yet ultimately unpopular 737. Even though about 400 of its predecessor were built, the newer 600 variant has the larger 737NG wings, which actually made it heavier than the 500 and less economical to operate as a result. That's also partly why the 600 never got the so-called 4th generation upgrade, as comical as the 737 MAX 6 would look. Then again, it too would still not be certified by now. Back at the gate, we were told there'd be a 30-minute delay due to ATC flow control into Vancouver, a common occurrence in the summer, so they had us wait in the gate area for a little longer. Soon enough, it was back on board the 737-600 for the equally short hop back to the lower mainland. After explaining to the crew why we were suddenly back on board again, my next seat would be further up this time in 4F, just forward of the wing this time. The 737-600 being so short, there are only really 3 rows where you can get a view in front of the engine, as opposed to side-on like this. As it happens, nobody was sitting in the row directly in front, so I moved to 3F for a slightly different, but much improved view. Just like last time, we were pushing back right away, and here's the departure back to Vancouver off runway 27. This flight back over the Strait of Georgia was just as brief, with only 18 minutes in the air. The first couple of minutes were full of the usual gorgeous views in some great sunset lighting. For 2 very brief joyrides on this very specific plane, a cornerstone of this channel, this evening's flights were a ton of fun. Our crew today was super friendly too, and were kind enough to let us stick around a bit longer after we landed in Vancouver. Since they were heading back home to Kelowna after, they also had some extra Air North cookies on board, which they very quickly handed out to everyone just before we started our approach. What a great touch, especially since you would never get any sort of in-flight service on this route, but with 40 people on board, it was still doable. I do miss seeing the WestJet 737-600s, since they were another one of those somewhat unique to Canada airliners, but that's what makes me so glad I was able to fly this one again with Aeroflyer. The other thing is, it was really cool to actually fly as a passenger on a KF airplane. KF has been a big inspiration for me over the years, and seeing their 727s and DC-10s flying, just over 10 years ago now, was such a pivotal part of my early plane spotting days. Aside from shipping myself in a box on one of their Convairs, this was the only way to realistically fly with them, so for that aspect too, this was a great couple of flights. I've heard rumors of Aeroflyer expanding their fleet to add more 737s in the future, so I wish them the very best, and maybe I'll get to fly with them again someday. Thank you very much for watching this special trip on the 737-600, and I will see you next time.